joining me now on the Knicks Film School Podcast. We're very, very excited for this conversation because I got his book a couple of weeks ago and I absolutely devoured it. And we're going to talk all about it. The name of the book is, of course, Pipeline to the Pros, How D3 Small College Nobodies Rose to Rule the NBA. One of the co-authors of the book, along with Danny Parkins, Ben Kaplan. What's going on, man?
How are you? Thanks for having me. I am very excited to be here. Although, as a Bulls fan, the timing is probably about as bad as it could be. And like the 40-year history of Knicks optimism and Bulls pessimism, I think we're at like an all-time gap.
In 40 years. So if we go back to, we obviously need to talk about this and get it out of the way. So 40 years brings us back to 1984. You had the year you drafted Jordan. So yeah, that's the time frame. I'm trying to think if there was a period of time.
You know what? 99.
Well, that was, oh yeah. And we went to the finals that year.
Yeah.
Yeah. But like, but even in 99, it was viewed, for me, from my vantage point, maybe you felt differently. It was viewed as kind of an interregnum where like they were just going to like, recoup their, it's like everybody had left, but they were going to get a good draft pick. And so like more good stuff was going to be on the way. Whereas this Bulls team, I don't know that the same faith exists that there is a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, but maybe you feel differently.
No, there's no pot of gold. There's no rainbow. There's just rain and clouds. Things are pretty bad. I mean, at that point, it was like, we're going to live forever. Yeah, Jordan, of course, we won some championships, but like this will happen. And then you get to the point now where, last year the Celtics won the championship. They had 18 titles in their franchise history. And I was like, that would mean we need 2 more Jordans to catch them.
And you know what? Those 2 Jordans might not be walking through that door. But walking through the door, many doors over the entire history of the NBA are a series of unheralded individuals who I feel like, let's start here with the book. I'm just curious because the whole joy of this book to me is as someone who is, I'd like to think that I am a diehard NBA fan. I consume every piece of like quality NBA content that I come across. I'm sure there's some stuff that I don't know about. And yet every time I flipped the page in Pipeline to the Pros, I was learning something new. I was finding a new anecdote that I had never heard before. And these are recognizable names. These are people that have woven the fabric of the league in one way or another, even if they may not have always been like out in front or like on the whole poster. They're like maybe to the side of the poster. So I just kind of want to start with like, where did you get the idea to tell this story about, this kind of group of individuals?
Thank you for saying that. First of all, that's a fantastic endorsement for the book and exactly what we were going for. And this started with a conversation between me and Danny Parkins. Danny is one of my oldest friends. The book will say he's a Chicago radio host, but he just recently took a job hosting the morning show on FS1. So now he's a national TV guy. And he is a massive NBA fan, same as me. We grew up watching the Jordan Bulls and came to love the game that way. And I played Division III basketball for a couple of years at Amherst College in Massachusetts, and had just noticed guys that I played against, guys that I played with, guys that coached me. Not only are they working in the NBA, they are really rising the ranks quickly and taking on leadership positions, and got me curious, like, how long has this been going on? How widespread is this? And I found out it was rampant. At the time we started the project, 12 out of the 30 NBA teams, their head coach and or their general manager had played Division III basketball. So almost half the league, which is wild. And then it goes back all the way to the very, very beginning of the league. And that was the thing that was like, okay, we've got something here. And when I bring it to Danny, who's this massive NBA fan, and I'm like, hey, did you know this stuff? And he's like, no, of course I didn't know this stuff. And I was like, well, would you be interested in working on this? He's like, really? You want me working on a D3 book? I was like, it's an NBA book. We've got a D3 angle. But once he learned about like the network side of it, he was into.
I think the I have to think one of the reasons, because there's how many content creators are out there, how many people who are journalists are like looking to write a book. I have to think one of the reasons that maybe nobody has ever thought of this before, my guess at least, would be that it's not like there's been a ton of D3 players. Like as you know, as of right now, unless I've missed something along the way, there's only one D3 player currently in the league, and it's our friend down in Miami, right? He's still the only one.
Yeah, Duncan Robinson is still the only one. Yeah,
I didn't want to say his name. I know he doesn't get off the bench much anymore, but he's caused me enough pain over the years. But at the same time, it's D3 people, and you weave the book. It's chronological, more or less, where you go basically from the beginning of the history of the league, and then you kind of move forward. But like all these D3 guys have been responsible for whether it's making a draft pick or, in a lot of times, coaching these guys that are so integral to the fabric of the history of the league. What themes, if any? And then I promise you we'll get to the Knicks specific stuff soon. Did you see start to emerge as you were doing the research and as you were writing the book?
I think the things that stick out between all the different characters that we talked about, and they all had different journeys. And I think that speaks to like the diversity of the Division III experience, because it is such a large division. There's way more schools in Division III than there is in Division I. But one is humility. So I shouldn't say nobody. I doubt anybody grows up shooting jumpers in their driveway saying like, I can't wait to play Division III basketball. Like that's not where the dream is headed. That's not where my dreams were headed.
Was that not you?
No. I was like, all right, it'll be Paxson, Kerr, Kaplan. That's what the Bulls legacy is going to be. That was not the case. So you are humbled because you didn't get the scholarship you were looking for. And then to choose Division III basketball means you are inconveniencing yourself to pursue the game you love. It's not always fun. It's definitely not glamorous. No scholarships, athletic scholarships in Division III. Yep. There are very rarely a lot of people in the stands for a Division III game. You're still working just as hard as the Division I players during the season. You still have practices, you still have games, you're still taking, if anything, we're not flying to games, we're taking long bus rides. They're not comfortable. Like, you've really got to love the game. And then you've got to be a self-starter, because in the fall and in the spring, you're not, we don't have guys doing workouts for us. You got to go to the gym and do the workout yourself. And a lot of the times, you hear stories about guys who that's how they got their start. They were running their teams through workouts, and they were finding their coaching voice even when they were a player. So those are, just a few of the themes that came through as we were talking to these guys, and learning their backgrounds and realizing like what might have equipped them to succeed at the NBA level. Especially now where when you come into the NBA, you're coming in as an intern, you're coming in the film room, you're not doing something, you're working in the NBA, which is awesome, but you're not doing something that's like that glamorous. You're not on the court with players. They're looking for the guys that are like, yeah, give me an office. I'll work 20 hours. I'll sleep on the floor. I don't really care. Like, I'm in it for the love of the game.
And speaking of love of the game, other than the fact that obviously it's told chronologically and it's all, goes back to the NBA, if the book has a spine, so to speak, it is this story of Andrew Olson, who you open every chapter with an additional snippet about his journey. And you start out when he was like a kid, and you go through, obviously he went to you went to the same school. It just dawned on me. There you go. How about that? What are the odds? But you take it all the way through his, where he eventually ended up. I thought that was so cool. I just have to ask, was that something that fell into place afterwards, or did you kind of see that being something that you would do?
No, it fell into place afterwards. I always planned on starting the story with, him at a restaurant, nobody knowing who he was.
You set the scene beautifully, by the way.
Thank you. It was me meeting him for lunch. That was the friend he was meeting. But I always thought that was a cool intro. Like, how does this guy get into the NBA? Well, let me tell you about how this network came to be. But the initial feedback we got when we were sending the book around to publishers with the proposal, was that they really liked the Andrew section and they wanted us to blow it out a little bit in the intro. So make that a little bit longer than, the stuff about the Frank Vogels and the Mike Budenholzers.
Yeah.
And then we got some really good advice. Danny's friends with Jeff Passan, the baseball insider for ESPN. And he asked him, like, who's the main character of your book? And we're like, well, we've got a lot. And he's like, well, are you writing a book or are you putting together a list? Which was a really cool thing to think about. And we're like, we need some thread. We need something to like give us some continuity and keep people reading. And the Andrew story became kind of the piece. And then the puzzle pieces came together, and it was really fun being like, okay, what parts of his background tie into this chapter about these guys in the 1960s, and how can we loop everything together? And it all kind of fell into place.
I love that. I loved that part of it. But I am thinking now, as you say it, like you need something to weave it all together. The part of what makes the book so cool is as you're going from chapter to chapter, you're coming across names from previous chapters about, because the NBA is kind of a small world, and that becomes so freaking clear. The more you read this is like, who's helping out who. One more before I get to, and this is actually kind of a good entryway into the Knicks specific stuff. And like everybody who's an NBA fan should read this book, but Knicks fans should really read this book. I'm going to ask you your total opinion. Do you think it's easier to come from D3 to get into the league now, or roughly around now, or way back in the day? And I'm like, part of me is thinking, well, like the NBA wasn't a big deal, and like a lot of people didn't aspire to be in the NBA once upon a time. So in theory, maybe it would be easier to stumble upon a job. Now, everybody wants to be in the NBA, but also there is a recognition, I feel like, and you make it clear through the book, of the value of these people that come through D3. So what do you think is easier, or do you think either is easier?
None of it's easy. I think it's easy. Yeah, definitely now, just because not only have there been, you don't have to use your imagination to say, what is this Division III basketball player going to do for my organization? You can just say, hey, Brad Stevens played Division III basketball. Tom Thibodeau played Division III basketball. Frank Vogel played Division III basketball. All these guys that have won championships or led their teams to success. And then another really interesting point that came up in my conversation with Kobe Altman, who's the GM for the Cleveland Cavaliers, is he said, hey, when I was coming up, which wasn't that long ago, this was 15 years ago, that he was looking for a job in the NBA, his only touch point to a Division III person in the front office would have been like, how do I get in front of Sam Presti? And he's already at the top. But now if you look at the Thunder organization, they've got other D3 guys, in the middle ranks, in the entry ranks. So if you're a D3 guy looking to make those connections, you can reach out to someone and say, hey, we played in the same conference, or we have some similarity in our background. And you're not so high up that it's going to be, I'm going to have to crawl through all sorts of layers just to get an email in your inbox and get it read. So that part makes it easier. There's also a lot more entry points. Like, coaching in the 1970s, you had 2 assistants on the bench. Now, they show the bench, they've got like 4 rows of assistants, and you've got guys that are doing, that makes it easier to get in. One thing that came up in a lot of our conversations, it actually came up first with Jeff Van Gundy, is, he was saying the size of the staffs is just something that is really difficult to navigate and manage. The prize of being an NBA head coach is there's so few jobs, and it's a really high salary, and it's very high paying, and you're getting competitive people. And it can be, cutthroat, and it's hard to get everybody rowing in the same direction. And it's hard to climb your way up through that mess.
Well, so that leads me, wasn't sure when I was going to bring this up, but I think my favorite anecdote in the book, or my favorite quote from the book, and I don't know if maybe he has said this somewhere else, I had not heard it before, is not from Jeff Van Gundy, but from Stan Van Gundy. And I think maybe where I'm going here with, like, it's not like if you're the most qualified, or if you're like the best coach, or you're the most qualified coach, you are automatically going to wind up on an NBA bench. You need luck. And I was hoping, there's certain things I definitely don't want to spoil. Are you okay giving the Stan story about how he tells it, basically, which is how, like, the break that he, according to him and his brother needed?
Yeah, absolutely. Would love to share it. So I found this clip on, I think it was on YouTube, of when we were deep in our research and just, searching every platform everywhere for anything about these guys that we're looking into. And Stan Van Gundy was speaking at a coaching clinic. And he said, sarcastically, as Stan Van Gundy is wont to do, he said, you got to plan out your career. And this is how I planned out mine. And he talks about, my brother, Jeff, he wanted a college job after his playing career. And instead he got a high school job in Rochester coaching at a boys Jesuit school, McQuaid. And he had a really good player there named Greg Woodard. And he was running Greg Woodard through a workout. And Greg Woodard, attracted the attention of some college assistants, including some assistants from Providence, where Rick Pitino had just taken the head coaching job. They wanted to canvass the area, get to meet not only some of the local players, but also some of the local coaches. So Stu Jackson and Herb Sendek go to that workout. They see Jeff Van Gundy working Greg Woodard through this workout. They're impressed with this young coach and the workout that he's putting his player through.
So they're going to see the player.
Right.
And
they end up liking the coach.
That's great.
So we talked to Stu Jackson about this. He said, we called Pitino and he said, hey, we're also looking for a GA. So keep your eyes peeled. And they said, hey, we think this Jeff Van Gundy guy might be a good fit. That's how Jeff Van Gundy gets to Providence. Ultimately, that connection with Jeff Van Gundy, Stu Jackson, and Rick Pitino leads to Rick Pitino goes to the Knicks, brings Stu Jackson along with him. Doesn't last long. Stu Jackson becomes the head coach. He needs an assistant. He hires Jeff Van Gundy. And then I won't go through all the different steps that lead to Stan Van Gundy getting into the NBA, but it's also through Stu Jackson. So it's really just this one workout in a gym in a high school in Rochester that leads to the Van Gundys being who they are. And when we talked to Jeff about this, he didn't lean into it as much as Stan, being like, without this workout, we're nothing.
Yeah.
But, he's definitely like, and all the guys we talked to, they're like, we're so lucky. We would have been happy being Division III coaches. We would have been happy being high school coaches. But they got the breaks along the way, and they also have egos, and they also know they're good, and they also work really hard. So they said, when we got those breaks, we're going to take advantage of them.
So that's interesting. So, okay. By the way, the Stan part of it, the part that I remember most from his journey or how he got to where he got is Jeff had already made it. I forget if he was already, I think he may have been Knicks coach at this point. Maybe he was still an assistant. I forget. But someone in the league was hiring, in an assistant job. And Jeff was talking to the person, and Jeff was like, hey, do me a favor, give my brother a call. Just but he had already proven the proof of concept, so to speak, as a former D3 player who rose to coach. And for that reason, the person gave Stan a call, brought Steph in, and sure enough, Stan wows them because Stan was a great NBA coach in his own right. But I want to come back to Jeff because, man, I've had Jeff Van Gundy on this pod, and I don't know how I didn't wet myself during that interview because he's like, I know you're a Bulls fan. You could imagine the love that a Knicks fan my age, I'm 41 years old, has for Jeff Van Gundy. He was already a cult figure to me. After reading what you wrote about him, somehow you have elevated him to a higher plane, because I came away from this almost feeling like after Van Gundy, it's like not the floodgates open necessarily, but here was this guy, and you talk about ego and like all these coaches, obviously Tibbs, like we know Tibbs has an ego. We're sure Jeff has an ego, but to combine that with like the outwork part and the different ways that you tell stories about how Jeff and Stan and Tibbs and Steve Clifford, who plays also a prominent role, same coaching tree, just like went above and above and above and beyond. Like, did you come away from writing it with the same impression that I did?
Researching the book totally changed my perspective of Jeff Van Gundy. To me, he was always, he looked like an accountant on April 14th, just like exhausted and
central casting.
And, yeah. So, we got a quote from someone being like, the bag, like I might not be, it was indirect from someone saying Jeff said this to them, so we can't attribute it to him, but it was something along the lines of like, I might not be 6'4", I might not have played in the NBA. The bags under my eyes is how I prove myself. Like it was always the work. Yeah. But we talked to Greg Woodard, the guy from that famous workout that got the Van Gundys their break. And we talked to another player from that McQuaid team. And they played for Jeff for 1 year when they were 16, 17 years old, when Jeff was 23 years old. And he changed their lives. He changed the way they worked. He changed the way they thought about what they could achieve. He's not just a worker. He's not just a grinder. He's definitely those things, but he is also like an incredibly inspirational person who can change the trajectory of someone's life by getting in touch with them. And that was the part that really opened my eyes to like the power of Jeff Van Gundy beyond just, I can outwork you. It was, I can outwork you and I can inspire you.
And that also came through as you were kind of telling, like, because usually in the NBA, or at least as far as I know, like oftentimes if a head coach gets fired, the staff goes with him. And yet Jeff kept surviving these regime changes with the Knicks. And that's saying something is in particular with the Knicks, because you want to talk about a franchise that historically has had a fair bit of turnover. It's New York. And this guy kept going. It's because clearly people within the organization was like, no, there's something about him. And then you get all these great quotes from Jeff talking about, look, at the end of the day, it's about the players. And like the players will make sure you have a job. So how do you make sure the players make sure you have a job? You make them better. And I feel like everything is rooted in the players, which is, again, I know I'm all over the place here, but like you bring up a few times throughout the book that there's been different philosophies throughout the history of the NBA. Sometimes there's more emphasis on, oh, it's the coaches, it's the system. And then other times it's like, no, it's what players you have. And this philosophy of Van Gundy, it emphasizes like, yeah, it's the players. But if you get the right coach with those players, that's where like the beautiful thing comes together. And it was just so incredible to read. And it's crazy to think like that's taken him so far, you know?
Yeah. And so the floodgates for this Division III network, like they really opened up in 1999 when you had the finals between the Knicks, coached by Jeff Van Gundy, and the Spurs, coached by Greg Popovich, who he didn't play Division III basketball, but he coached at a Division III school. And both those guys opened the doors for so many of the people that we talk about in our book. And both those schools of coaches would tell you that they are only where they are now. They only stuck in the NBA because of the players that they had on their team. And not just because the players were good, but that the players were humble and willing to be coached. I think one of the coolest parts of the Jeff Van Gundy coaching tree is that Patrick Ewing is a part of it. Like he was an assistant with Steve Clifford, and like that they love Patrick Ewing. Patrick Ewing loves them. And it was because he was really good and also was willing to be coached. And then when you talk about the Spurs with Tim and Tony and Manu, like everybody you talk to from that world, if you can talk to them, they are very reclusive. They will tell you that it was those guys. It starts and ends with those guys because they were willing to be coached hard, and it let Coach Popovich do his job as well as he could do it.
Yeah, and it is interesting that, you know, you have this whole chapter on the Van Gundy coaching tree out of Jeff and Stan and Steve Clifford. And you mentioned Andy Greer in the book, which I obviously knew Andy Greer had gone back with Tibbs, and obviously he's a Knicks assistant coach now. That was so cool to learn that Andy he goes back to like to Jeff Van Gundy. I didn't realize that.
Yeah. So Andy Greer met Jeff Van Gundy so Jeff had a crazy college journey that we detail in the book that started at Yale. The book
just for that.
Yeah.
it's wild.
We got a quote from his last college coach. He had 4 stops in college. His last college coach said he was the transfer portal before the transfer portal. So Jeff's second to last stop in college was at Brockport State, where his dad was the coach. And he only lasted there a year because his dad got let go. And Jeff is fiercely loyal, so he wasn't going to stick around after that happened. And another player on that team was Andy Greer. And we talked to Jeff and Stan's father for the book, and he said, you know, Andy Greer's like my third son. Like he goes way back with the family. And so, yeah, those relationships they go back. And the interesting thing is, like, they are really close friends. And then Jeff also, helped get Steve Clifford in the league, and they were not like the closest of friends. It was kind of a loose connection, but he saw something he liked, and he saw something that he valued in Cliff, and brought him into the league.
I lied. My favorite anecdote from the book is when Cliff he's not a full coach yet, right? It's when he's still
Cliff he was volunteering as an assistant at a D2 school, I think, at the time. And so normally when people take those positions, they teach PE during the day, or they do something during the day, and then make it to the gym, coach, and then go home at night. Cliff wanted the experience of being a coach. He wanted to be in the office all day with the coaches. So rather than take a day job, he took a night job at a boot factory, where he was, he said he was sitting on a chair, a piece of rubber would come by, he'd have to cut it, happen about every 30 seconds. And in between, he was reading like biographies of famous world leaders to pass the time.
There was that. And then it was another, there's so many great, I can't tell you how many great stories are in this book, but another one where he's working under Van Gundy and Tibbs, and he gets in at like the office, I don't know what time, 5:30 in the morning. I forget what he told in the book. And he figures, I'm going to be the first one there. And like Van Gundy and Tibbs are already there. And they're like, where you been?
Yeah,
it's like, what took you so long? Yeah. It really drives home how hard they work. I want to get to Tibbs briefly because he's the last one of this group. That's what I was getting to, that is still coaching in the league. And, you write about Tibbs, and the way you write about it, again, it's clearly like he is just this worker, but also these types of personalities and, what they demand of the players. I think there's a reason maybe that these guys don't always last the longest. So I'm curious, like, again, kind of your opinion. Do you think the coaches from maybe not the tree directly, but like cut out of that kind of cloth, like that approach coaching in the way Van Gundy did and Tibbs does? Do you think that they are long for, this world in NBA terms? Do you think we're always going to have guys like that, or they're kind of going to go the way of the dinosaur?
I think we're always going to have guys like that.
Yeah.
I think the way that so the difference between so Tibbs, he might, if you ask him, pick one coaching tree that you're from, he would probably pick Bill Musselman.
Yeah.
And when you look at the way like Musselman handled his players versus the way the Van Gundys handled, like there's a little bit more of a modern touch. You don't have the Bobby Knight approach that we had in the past, or screaming and yelling and belittling players and coaching through fear. I think there's been enough research and studies. There was a really interesting study that found they labeled NBA coaches as like authoritative or like collaborative, and the players that played for authoritative coaches underperformed and continued underperforming even after they played for that coach.
Really?
So I think, fascinating. I think there's been enough to say that this type of, you've got to inspire people through their own intrinsic motivation rather than pushing them to the point of the teacher and whiplash sort of thing. But at the same time, accountability is really important. And there are coaches in the league who don't hold people accountable. And, this is something that Anthony Edwards has talked about with Chris Finch, who's another person that we talk about in the book, how much he loves that Chris Finch holds him accountable. And the fact that he's a superstar who's willing to be held accountable is one thing, but those are the types of coaches that get the most out of their players. So you got to have both.
Yeah, you do. And you also have to have someone who knows how to put the pieces of the puzzle together the right way, which leads me to the chapter which prominently features Leon Rose. I'm going to read you. So this is a quote that you got from someone I'd frankly never heard of before, but I'm sure is a prominent sports writer in South Jersey, Walt Burroughs. When Leon Rose was playing high school ball, he compared him to Pete Rose, and he said he's a leader, dives for loose balls, makes the big plays, and does a slow burn when things aren't going right for his Cherry Hill East high school team. I did not know before reading this that Leon Rose had any sort of a playing career, and you make it so clear like through telling of his history, how the Knicks are. Maybe this is just me fantasizing, but in my imagination, the Knicks are the way they are in part because Leon espouses, or when he played as a player, so many of the qualities that now you have, like obviously with Tibbs, but also the players that they're going out and collecting. Did you know any of this before you started writing this book about Leon Rose?
No, had no idea that he had a playing babackground at all.
That's wild.
We started this project with a list of all the NBA GMs, NBA coaches throughout the history of the league. I was like, okay, where did they go to college? Did they play sports there? And sure enough, Leon Rose, he played basketball. And he, I mean, obviously in relation to NBA players, no, he wasn't that level. But like if you ran into Leon Rose in a men's league in the Philly area, 20, 30 years ago, you were in for some trouble. Like I found a lot of newspaper clippings of, Leon Rose scored 30 points in this JCC game, or Leon Rose scored 28 in this Lawyers League game. Like, he was a good player. And not only that, he was, and I think has always been throughout his career, the ideal teammate and the person that you would want on your team. My favorite Leon Rose anecdote that we found in newspaper clipping is that his high school basketball coach named Leon the godfather to his child when Leon was playing for him as a high schooler. I don't know about you, but like nobody was naming me a godfather of their child when I was 17 or 18 years old because of the example I was leading.
I don't think anyone's naming me godfather of their child now, and I'm a 41-year-old man. So no, I don't think anyone was naming me as a 17-year-old.
Yeah. I mean, it's wild. And yeah, it just sounded like we couldn't find a lot about him from his college playing days, but the type of person he is, you think agent, I don't know what type of stereotypes that pulls in, but like, he's not this like all sizzle, no steak, schmoozy sort of, like, I think we might've had a line in the book. Like he's not Ari Gold. He's more Jerry Maguire than Ari Gold. He's a leader. He's an empowerer of people. And I think you see that with how the Knicks are run. It's like, he has brought in the right people. He has delegated correctly, and that's allowed them to have success, even though he didn't have experience doing the job.
Well, I think the biggest thing that came through for me with Leon, other than the stuff about what type of player he was, is that that you kind of just touched on it, this idea of collaboration and hearing all the voices in the room and then making a decision, and this quality of being maybe not so much a delegator, but like, yeah, I guess kind of a delegator. Everybody kind of has their thing that they do. And at the end of the day, like, yeah, the buck is going to fall on him. And I feel like the way you tell it, those were, and this is getting me back to like the book at large, the advantage I almost feel like that D3 players or former D3 players or former D3 coaches have is that they had to worry about life outside of basketball. So they had to hone all of these other traits and skills and qualities, oftentimes in completely different fields. Like obviously the story of Leon Rose, he was, even before he was an agent, there was a time where he was involved in basketball at all. And how those skills come back to help them as they're making their way up the NBA ranks. And I do you think that is like an advantage? I mean, it's a weird way to say it, but it feels like it from reading the book. Yeah,
no question. It's absolutely, it's a huge advantage. Brad Stevens, even though it wasn't extensive experience, Brad Stevens worked a day job. He was a marketing person at a pharmaceutical.
That was wild.
Yeah. Whatever. Kobe Altman. So I knew Kobe. He was my graduate assistant when I was in college, my junior and senior year. He had a real estate career, and he was like, I love basketball. I'm going to do this instead. We all looked at him like he was crazy. Like you were living in this beautiful apartment. You were brokering huge deals. You were making a ton of money. You're coming back to live in Amherst, Massachusetts and hang out with us. Worked out really well for him. But like, those experiences that they had and the experience that, Leon Rose had this twice. He had it as a lawyer. Yep. He was a very successful lawyer, a partner in a firm. And then he was an agent, and he was an incredibly successful agent. And then, he's done this. So all of that experience, it's the whole thing of like, the point of the book Range by David Epstein, where if you're a generalist, if you're able to pull from different experiences, it really does help you in whatever job you're going to have, especially if those experiences are relevant in some way.
I know we're running short on time, so one more, I'm going to get you out of here. You talk, or you allude at different points in the book, or I got the sense at least that you alluded to the idea that like, if you, and by the way, I should say throughout the entire book, you have these great charts where you have specific data year by year of, like, for instance, the percentage of whether it's coaches or front office execs that made it to, each different level, like whether they play in the NBA or D1 or anything. But you kind of, I felt you like alluded to the challenge of, well, if it's a stars league and it's all about the players, and they are, whether taking orders from someone or entrusting their careers to someone who never made it to that highest thing, that was something that historically needed to be overcome. I'm wondering if you think that is still out there at all, because it was a question that I wondered as I was finishing up reading it.
It's one of those things that I think will always ebb and flow. And I think it'll ebb and flow with who is having success, because there tends to be copycats of, this person succeeding. But they're the successful coaches of the last 20 years. If you look back on it, like, sure, Jason Kidd, the Mavs made it far last year. So there's a former player. That's a great success story. But you've got Greg Popovich. He played at Air Force. He didn't have he was a really good player, but he didn't play in the NBA. And then, Mike Budenholzer won a championship. He's a D3 player. Frank Vogel won a championship. He's a D3 player. Joe Mazzulla won a championship. He topped out at the D1 level. I think players can see that it doesn't really matter how far you made it as a player, as long as you can help get them, as long as the coach can help get the players better.
And man, I'm just thinking about what you said earlier too, like the fact that you made, such a like you as a D3 player, you're not getting anything out of this other than obviously the love of the game and the ability to participate. You're not getting any money out of it. You're not getting on TV. You're not going to get you're not going to get drafted or anything like that. So it's like these guys could, for instance, like you could play, all these guys could play, but they also had that dedication that even though that path did not have the guarantee that maybe it did for some of these other guys, maybe it's the perfect combination. I'm maybe, so this is my last question. Do you think maybe we haven't topped out yet? Do you think may see even more people come through this pipeline?
We could. You never know. One thing that's happening across sports is coaches and executives are getting younger.
Well, that's obvious. Yeah.
And another advantage of being a Division III player is you are not going to have an NBA career unless you're Duncan Robinson. So you can get right in and start working. So when you're 22 years old, you're learning how to be a coach. We talked to Will Hardy for the book, who's the Utah Jazz head coach. And he said something like, coaching is a profession. I had to learn how to be a coach. Just because I know a lot about basketball doesn't mean I necessarily know how to coach it.
Yeah.
And so he's able to, sit in a room with Greg Popovich and cut film with him and learn from him and learn from R.C. Buford and learn from Mike Budenholzer and do all that when he's in his 20s versus, what an NBA player is doing in their 20s. But that being said, one thing that Hardy said to me was, the experience of being an NBA player is something I will never have and something I will never be able to replicate. So he's going to try to make up for it in other ways. And he obviously brings other things to the table. And that's why you see, Frank Vogel, at every stop he went to as a coach, his top assistant was a former NBA player who was well respected because he knew you had to have that balance.
I'm so jealous that you got to write. I know it was, I can't imagine how much work, but the fact that you got to have all these conversations, I can't imagine how cool that was. I mean, forward by Jeff Van Gundy, you got Woj doing the little blurb at the top. If you're a basketball fan, do not walk, run to get Pipeline to the Pros. Seriously, I cannot have enjoyed this book any more than I did. Ben Kaplan, amazing stuff. Any last thoughts before I get you out of here?
No, thank you. I really appreciate all the kind words, and love hearing about the book. It was a lot of work. It was a labor of love for Danny and me, and we're really excited to hear when people enjoy it. So if you do check it out, hit us up and let us know. It means the world.
And where can people find you? Are you on you drop a Twitter handle or something?
Yeah, I was I think before this book started, I had about 24 followers on Twitter, and now we're climbing the ranks slowly. You can find me on Twitter. I'm at bkaplan4. And then check out Danny's show on FS1 Breakfast Ball with Craig Carton and Mark Schlereth. Just started up about a week and a half ago. So make sure to check that out as well. They'll be talking a lot of NFL for now, but they'll get into NBA stuff as the season rolls on.
Eventually. It always comes back around. Ben Kaplan, this was awesome. Thanks so much for coming on, man.
Thank you.